And we are live. Good morning, November 5th, 2020. What an amazing, important date, but no, we're not going to talk about elections. That's not the topic today. I see already our industry fellows joining us. Virginia, so good to see you again. Hi, good
Hello.
morning, how are you?
Good, very good, thank you.
So where are you dialing in from this morning?
I'm in the beautiful mountain town of Leavenworth, Washington, a little Bavarian themed village a few hours out of Seattle, and very close to the Wenatchee Valley here, which is the apple capital.
Amazing. Thanks for joining us again. Thanks for taking the time. Alex, so nice to meet you. Where are you dialing in from?
Nice to meet you too. I'm dialing in from New Jersey in a town called Great Meadows, and I'm actually on a farm. That's where I live. So I'm at home because we're in New Jersey and we're still under, quarantine.
Beautiful. On a farm in New Jersey. That's
Yes.
a good way to start and enjoy also this quarantine phase. And last but not least, Pete, so good to meet you.
Hey,
Thanks for taking the
hey,
time.
Tommaso.
Well, where
Yeah,
is
no
home to
problem.
you, or where are you right now?
Well, as you can probably see in that corner of my screen, it's a bit dark here because I'm in Europe. I'm in the Netherlands. So we have a pilot plant over here that I'm helping set up at the moment. So thankfully,
Amazing.
not quite under full lockdown, not under house arrest, but yeah, we're certainly being careful when it comes to social distancing.
And how is the weather right now in the Netherlands? Did already the cold start?
Yes, yeah, it's dipped below 10 degrees now, so we're a bit chilly.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, to take the time on November the 5th to join us on our virtual coffee. It is actually our 14th virtual coffee, in our episode 14th of the year 2020, and it is our second season. People ask us, well, why virtual coffee? What is a virtual coffee? Well, the easiest way to respond to what the virtual coffee is, it's right this. Exactly, Virginia. Thank you so much, right? Raise a mug, either of coffee or of tea. Wow, we have it all together. Wait a second, let it screenshot. Let it screenshot. Awesome, everybody with the mug in their hand. So that's what a virtual coffee is, right? So virtually meeting and discussing a topic that is relevant for the world. With whom? Well, with a curated panel of industry fellow. And the perspective is always future back. And what is the market we are discussing right now in the season 1 and season 2? What problems are we trying to educate, to solve? Well, we focused on the problem on how to feed by 2050, 10 billion people. But the focus here is on protein, on the next generation of protein. And we have an amazing lineup that I've already had the pleasure to chit chat here. And now I would like to formally introduce from left to right. And let me now start here looking at my notes on my other monitors. We have already the pleasure, Virginia, a couple of weeks ago to present her startup. She's founder and CEO of the Better Hutch, an innovative startup that converts mealworms and their waste into high value proteins, oils, and nutrients for agriculture within a regenerative food system. What a pleasure to have you back today on our virtual coffee.
Thank you, thank you.
And we have Peter, who already mentioned for friends, Pete. So Pete, I'll go with Pete. By the way, Pete, my name, since I've been living here in the States, because it's pretty complicated, Tommaso, Starbucks renamed me T, right, with the letter T, not the drink tea. So friends, for friends tea. So Pete is CEO and co-founder of Deep Branch Biotechnology. Forbes 30 under 30 in 2019. Congratulations. A molecular microbiologist with a specific interest in synthetic biology and genome editing technology. Pete, so great to have you today on our virtual coffee.
Thanks very much, T. I didn't go quite as extreme as you. I've left 4 letters in my name. So yeah, Pete to you, Pete to my friends. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, you left out only the R and I killed my entire name, but it's okay,
Yeah.
as long as it's easy, right? And last but not least, Alexander, who goes with Alex Socks, strategy and business development and at a brand first. What a pleasure, Alex, to allow us to pick your brain today here on our episode 14.
Oh, thank you very much, T. It's great to be here and amongst really incredible company. So I'm honored.
Very excited, very excited. Because before we kick off things, we would like to thank our partner who allow us to make this episode available here to the market, Awesome Ventures, a CVC as a service, and Silicon Valley, the Transformative Innovation Institute. And also, as always and as usual, for those out there on the Twitter channels we've curated, the Facebook pages and groups, the LinkedIn, you name it, obviously the YouTubes or here on Zoom, please start submitting your question, because within the next 45 minutes, we'll pick one question per industry fellow, and we will be asking live and will be responded live from the industry fellow. And without further ado, I would like to welcome, not on stage, but the virtual stage, right, on the screen, our industry fellow, and kick off things actually with Virginia. Curious to pick your thoughts and your perspective on the following question, Virginia. How can biotechnology enable more sustainable protein? In other words, what are some of Beta Hatch technology capabilities to convert insects and their waste into high value proteins, oils, and nutrients for agriculture? Please take it from here.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion, because I know Pete's got some thoughts on this topic as well. I'm an entomologist by training, did my PhD in insect-related topics in both genomics and chemical ecology at UC Berkeley, and started the business with really that scientific mindset. And I think that it's often sort of overlooked just how complex any of the crops that we grow are. We've seen just how important biotechnology has been for just staples and the regular part of the food system. And it's not all genome editing, it's basics like breeding and taking a really in-depth approach to understanding the organism that you're growing. And so I think that, in our industry and the insect side of the equation, there's a huge amount of innovation needed on the process side, engineering, equipment, making sure that we have scalable technology. But then at the sort of opposite end of the spectrum, on the very small side of the equation, there's also a lot of opportunity to improve the product, to decrease costs. We've been doing a lot of work on, for example, probiotics for bugs. So this idea that just as our bodies do best when we have the best microbes that are working for us in our digestion and in our immune systems, it's the same with insects. So I think that, just wanted to kind of open it up and have a discussion about the role that biotechnology plays in each of these sectors. I think once you have the ability to mass produce, which in insects is still an ongoing challenge, there's definitely a huge amount of demand that really exceeds supply, but then you have to kind of pair that with the biology side of making sure that you've got the right breeding stock, making sure that you are taking the right precautions for animal health. Our bugs can get sick just like any other animals can. So there's a lot of interesting technologies in creating the best crop possible and the most sustainable. So I think on the sustainability side, in our case, it's really looking at what are the inputs for the system. So I know, I'm curious, Pete, you do CO2 as the input, right, to your system? And I think, just as the source of that CO2 is going to change the sustainability of your product, it's the same for us. The source of the feedstock that we give the bugs is going to change how sustainable ultimately the product is. If we're competing with food for inputs, that's really not an alternative that makes sense. And so we're looking at things like mycotoxin contaminated crops. Our insects can break down mycotoxins completely. And so far we've done screens of over 300 metabolites, and there's not really any indications of residual toxicity. So that is an incredible demonstration of just these little digestive powerhouses that our bugs are.
Amazing. What an experience you have, and what a perspective, Pete. Virginia ping-ponged a couple of times and tried to ping-pong your thoughts on this. What are your thoughts actually on this? I'm curious to hear your perspective on biotechnology and sustainability.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think you flagged it up front, whereby you said, we're facing a growing population, 10 billion people by 2050. And it's not just more people, it's more people eating more. So really, we have to think beyond the conventional linear value chains, whereby, we're using arable land for food or for feed or for fuels. And these are all three competing areas that would need to use those inputs. So I think, as Virginia said there, it's really important to understand what potentially valuable inputs there are out there and how they can be valorized. So in our instance, that's taking it back to a really simple molecular level and saying, okay, what is the one thing that the world has far too much of, and we'd love something to do with that CO2, granted. And in some ways, at least logistically speaking, that's certainly a smaller challenge than looking at specific co-products or waste streams within agriculture or within food and saying, okay, well, here's a niche that we can really tap into. So I think, obviously, there's no silver bullet to these problems, and having a nuanced approach and having multiple weapons in the arsenal to try and battle this is the way we have to go.
Yeah, I would just echo that I think there's a lot of need for multiple solutions. The venture community certainly sort of rushes to winner takes all approach, and I constantly get questions about how our company will compete with other companies, and it's an important thing to be aware of and knowledgeable of, but the landscape's so huge and these problems and market opportunities are so huge that no one company can solve all of these problems, and no one technology. So even within my field of insect production, there's going to be multiple species, multiple operating approaches, multiple strains of insects that emerge as winners and can help start solving these problems. And we kind of all need to be working together in the alternative protein sector to meet that incredible demand.
Well, very well said. We will have enough mouth to feed, right? And so we will have a different protein sources. Let me double down, Pete, here and with a follow-up question. What are some of the preconditions in order to establish the most environmentally friendly food on a large scale? And large scale is always a big challenge when it comes to extract of alternative protein. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think just coming back to what preconditions we can have to make that work, and for me, really, it's about more transparency in the food chain, right? So there's all sorts of reasons why transparency is important, but I think first and foremost, having more data on what the carbon intensity or the other environmental or ecological impacts of our food is really important. And if we can empower consumers with that, if we can have clear messaging to them to that point, then it enables day-to-day decision making to be made in the supermarket, in the grocery store. If you've gone to the extent and you've got that data available at your hands, you can also bring in some, let's say, more sticks rather than the carrots. You can say taxation based on carbon intensity would be possible. And, I think people are going to great efforts to collect this data already. Certainly a lot of the animal feed companies that we work with are indexing the carbon intensity of all those ingredients that they use. So it's not that data isn't there. It's just a question of having standardized, uniform ways to measure that impact. Which is actually something that we're working on. So we work with the University of Leiden here in the Netherlands and the Joint Research Council for the EU. And this work is to have a standardized life cycle assessment for the impact of foods and ingredients within foods and feed. So by using this, you can actually have a traffic light system, certainly like in the supermarkets in Europe. I'm not sure if you have it in the US, whereby you can have a look and you see, okay, fats, sugars, salts, is it red, is it orange, or is it green? Based on that, I can make an informed decision. We're saying you should have that not just for CO2, but maybe water intensity as well. And so as a consumer, you have that availability at your fingertips, and you can really just put your money where your mouth is, vote with your wallet. I think that's the best way we can really work towards sustainability in a big way.
Yeah, it's education, it's transparency, right? And you mentioned a keyword, which is very relevant here. And we have actually somebody who exactly focuses on that, is messaging, right? Because on one hand, we can produce something, right? And then but how do we get it into the shelf? And actually, how do we convey, right, Alex, to the target audience on why pick it, right? Why choose that specific alternative protein product, right? So what are the challenges when it comes to positioning, messaging, right? When it comes really to create this awareness for the target audience when it's related to food of the future. What are your experiences there, Alex?
Sure. So I think it's interesting, actually, just relevant to this conversation, that we're talking about, there's two scientists basically on the other half of this program, and T as well. I think you have a science background. But what I find interesting is there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to what science offers the public at large and how the public perceives food and science sort of intermingling together. It's something that already exists, but I think a lot of people are in denial about what processed food means, what all of these things mean. And also, it seems that within scaling up as an issue and a complexity that companies are dealing with these new technologies and innovations, that there's a lot of bureaucracy that has yet to really settle some of these problems. I know in the States, certainly we have not gotten there yet, especially with cellular agriculture, et cetera. But true innovation being, the introduction of something new, how do we, in a front-facing aspect, deal with it to help explain it, to educate it, to clarify it, to make sure that the messaging, both the visualization of that messaging and purely the words that, drive the content to express something. There's a lot of cultural, identity issues going on. For example, you talk about mealworm from Virginia when she's talking about mealworms and how that is being introduced in a way that's really like it's within the agricultural loop, right? So you're actually using those pieces to help the system in a more sustainable way. That's something that usually people just don't consider agriculture. They don't really consider farming. It's more of a political issue these days than it is something that people comprehend. So I think it's very interesting that companies, it's very important and interesting that companies that are on the cusp of new technologies really use their wherewithal to have assistance, to have insights that lay the foundation for creative thinking that brings the message forward with clarity.
Which is the big challenge, Virginia? What is your experience? You want to actually maybe to jump in right?
Yeah, I was gonna say two things. First is that I'd be very interested to just see some data on this, but I know at least from a market standpoint, we know more people are getting into backyard agriculture, if you want to call it that. Producing their own food. One of our main customers sells our mealworms for backyard chickens, so folks that have chickens for making their own eggs. And these are almost like a hybrid of, food production and pet, right? You go and cuddle the chicken that gives you those eggs, and you want to treat them well. And so you want to know what you're feeding them, because what you feed them is something you put in your own body. And those trends, and I think this year in particular, with people being home more, hopefully people are starting to feel more connection to their food. I think that we've seen people go back to, at least on the making side of baking, and I think also on the producing side of growing their own food. So hopefully that's a trend that continues. And yeah, on the communication side, it's interesting. I'm a scientist turned entrepreneur, and I've seen a lot of those challenges. And the way that scientists are trained to talk about what they do is very, it's very much in a sort of cautious way. Science is always evolving, and the sort of degree of certainty that exists in science is never 100%. There's always opportunity and possibility for more growth. And so you kind of get trained to use a lot of maybes and not, have concreteness in your statements. And that's completely the opposite of what you need to do in business. And so I know as a scientist turned entrepreneur, I've had to train myself to be careful about how conservative I am, because I already have a natural tendency to, be a little bit cautious in my statements. And that can really communicate in science, it communicates authenticity and sort of that you understand the scientific process, whereas in business, it can miscommunicate a sense of, a lack of conviction or something. So those are interesting. I don't know if Pete's experienced the same thing, but that's definitely been something I've experienced.
Yeah, curious to hear that, Pete. What's your transition or your experience on that?
No, certainly. So I'd echo Virginia's points. Obviously, coming from a technical background into a more commercial role, which has been for me a gradual evolution. Obviously, I sit as CEO now, but I have held commercial positions in previous companies. But it's certainly definitely a learning curve when you come out of academia and you come into the real world, and you have to really start communicating value and being very careful about the language that you use. And I think, pulling together a few themes that we've discussed already, Alex is saying that we need to, as an industry, think more carefully about how we communicate that innovation. And I think, the 90s proved how to do this very badly when it came to genetic engineering technologies. You think of Frankenfoods, of genetically engineered tomatoes, for example. It's not that we do any GM at Deep Branch, but that's, an example of what I mean. I think other things that you have to bake into it when you're considering these things are, by definition, as an entrepreneur, as a startup, you want to be resource limited. Especially if you're building a deep tech company that's very focused on developing, cutting edge technology. Particularly as the CEO, as the financial controller of the company, you need to be thinking, where is the best spend of my resources? And, with this point, what I mean is, this is really where the community aspect of alternative protein has to come in, right? We have to be able to work together and pool our resources because it's for the good of the industry that we can all work together and really communicate what the problems are and how collectively we're solving them. To Virginia's point, there will be what we would say in England as different horses for different courses, right? There's different circumstances where you would require different solutions. And that is where it becomes down to the individual companies to say, okay, this is our nuanced take on how we're changing alternative protein. But as an industry, there is a real, I think a real burden amongst all of us to be able to really clearly communicate why alternative protein is such a big thing and not just a hype, not just a buzzword, but something that we really need to fix in the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's here to stay for sure. It needs a lot of education, and in order to get there, collaboration. Absolutely echo that. Question is, how far education costs always money, right? A lot of money, right? You mentioned it, as a CEO, we have always a couple of things in common: huge vision to change the world, right? And limited resources to do so, right? So question is, when, the end user is in front of the shelf, right? And this is, and I kind of guinea pigged myself and say, okay, how are you going to differentiate of things that are repackaged and kind of labeled of alternative protein? Because this is also a trend or a movement that we see in parallel from bigger players, without mentioning names, right? And then those startups who really are into sustainability, into, a circular economy approach, right? So how, and you mentioned labeling, right? You mentioned the fact of labeling, Pete. So what needs to happen? What needs to happen? And this question is maybe in order for the consumer standing in front of the shelf and say, no, I recognize this ABC, right? Oops, it's cozy now. Oh, I can recognize this label or this signal, right? And yeah, that's exactly what I want to represent. That's exactly what I want to eat, right? What are your thoughts there? I mean, it's more a vision, maybe. Any? Does that make sense where I'm going with this?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really important problem, certainly for us to think about, and I would presume Virginia as well, because if you think about those companies that you're referencing there, a lot of those are consumer facing, or at least they're only separated by 1 degree from the consumer, right? In contrast, us at Deep Branch, we don't even sell our product to farmers, right? We work with animal feed producers who then sell the feed to farmers, and then it goes through, a distributor, packager, and then it gets sold on the supermarket shelf. So we're really far up the value chain, up the food chain, if you will, from the end user, or the end consumer of that protein product. So really being able to develop our communication channels with consumers and understand the value that we add, I think there is a great degree of importance in that. And like I said, I think for us, particularly because we do have a huge carbon saving in what we do, communicating that in terms of carbon impact is a big thing. I mean, I can give a good example of another company here in the Netherlands who are doing a great job with this. And what they've done is they're also an insect company called Protix. They've partnered with an egg producer. And they have insect-fed eggs on the supermarket shelf that I can go and buy here today. And that's basically engaging with the consumer to say, look, you can make an informed decision based on what the animals that have created this product are fed. And that is one of the only examples that I can really find where I as a consumer can go and make that choice, which is really fantastic, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an example I was actually going to bring up. They've done a great job, and certainly the challenges in the US are different than in Europe. The European base is already very bought into sustainability, and sort of the consumer is a lot more motivated and educated than in the US, where I think that there's some different challenges in just getting people to the table for sustainability. But I would say that, word choice is really important. And as much as we can align with this idea of something being natural, as opposed to, synthetic, something being sustainable, as opposed to even the word alternative. We always say alternative protein. It's just protein. By labeling it alternative, we're putting ourselves in this category that sort of takes us away from the table with the other, protein players. It's all just protein. And I would almost say, sustainable protein is probably the better label, because that's a unifying theme. The reason there's been a drive to look for other options is because there's either an environmental or an economic or some other issue with the sustainability of the existing supply chain. And part of it is just the volume of demand, and part of it is what the consumers are looking for. And, I know here we've also been trying to forge some relationships with directly with producers that have more interaction with the consumer to help sort of drive demand. And that egg example is a great one. There's a company here in Washington State that had a label of vegetarian fed eggs, which they thought would be very successful until they started getting calls from people saying, well, I know that, chickens eat bugs, so that's not really the right label. And so they actually removed that from their label because of that. So I think, again, trying to align with it's natural for the animals that we're feeding to eat these things. And it's more sustainable when we have this more circular approach to the food system. And those are the kinds of words I think we need to be using more.
Sustainable protein. Loved it. Yeah, no, it's
get the word alternative out of your
I'd be interested to see how polarizing you may think. Maybe Alex, this is a question for you. Tom, sorry, I'm asking your questions here, but that messaging around alternative protein, do you think that puts a lot of consumers off?
Yeah, I think if I may, T, I think what the issue at hand really is perception, right? So alternative, I was thinking about alternative music, for example. That has become, really this word that you understand that it's not mainstream, although it's become mainstream, right? That was back when alternative music, okay. So it's similar. The word choice and how you define what these proteins are, where they are, where you find them, it's problematical, because you have a case of traditional proteins, and then where do you find what is not traditional? So those things have started to move together, and that's very important, because when they do, it's a better chance for companies that are innovating in their proteins to really showcase what they're about, to communicate it, to educate it, and to really make it, part of the protein, that we eat and that we consume and that we can be happy with and that we can be proud of. Not to say that you shouldn't be happy or proud if you're, eating chicken or fish that's sustainably harvested, but I think to have those alternatives actually come into the mainstream will really make for a better system of food.
Yeah, and I think Pete and I are in the same boat, where our customers are on the feed side of the equation, and no one thinks that people love to eat meat, but they don't think about what meat eats. That's just not in anyone's mind. Right. So we also end up constantly having to remind everyone that we're not interested in having you eat bugs. Don't be afraid. This is not, let's give everyone bugs in some sort of dystopian science fiction. This is, we're trying to replace proteins in animal diets that are less sustainable and more volatile. And we're trying to really help farmers and the producers of the proteins you already like to eat make their products better. And so I think that can also become a communication challenge because this whole feed sector is just one that's sort of hidden to most consumers. And so it becomes a real marketing challenges for companies that are in the feed sector, because immediately, the thought is, well, you want me to eat microbes? You want me to eat bacteria? You want me to eat algae? You want me to eat bugs? Like, that's not what we're trying to do, but there's a lot of mixed messages that can come about.
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
I think the feed industry is actually a really good example to point to when you talk about protein, right? Because here it's really talking about really precise nutrition, because these animals basically have a very similar diet for a lot of their life. So if you're not optimizing that single meal that they're eating, then over time they will be nutrient deficient. So you need to make sure that really you're nailing their nutrition far more than you'd expect maybe with an Olympic athlete, right? These guys have much tighter control over animal nutrition than we would do over our athletes. But if you look at what goes into the feed, a lot of it is soy protein meal, right? That's where it comes from. One of the top 10 produced crops worldwide. 90% of soy goes in to feed the animals that we eat. And it's not really there for any other reason other than protein. So I think, Virginia, you probably agree with me on this one, that it makes more sense to find alternate means of providing that nutrition rather than using arable land that could be used to make something, much more interesting. We're talking about just purely providing a nutritional content of protein, but let's not forget that the whole pleasure of eating food is the variety of what we can grow on our land and enjoying that. So let's not waste all our arable land just making something purely for protein when there are much more sustainable means to do so.
Yeah, there's already, I think it's a third of cropland is going to feed animals. We could be making so much direct food for humans, and producing proteins that people do want to directly eat, like the pea proteins that are going into some of these new products. Yeah, it's interesting because I think also the protein conversation obscures this fact that there's other nutrients, right? Like 30% of our product is actually fat and oils. So we can be replacing fish oil in animal diets. And that has sometimes more value than the protein component of our product. So I think this idea more of nutrition, anytime you have a new crop, that crop is made of building blocks that has value across the supply chain. And so, any company that's like, Beta Hatch or Deep Branch that's doing basically a platform of production, that from there's a lot of opportunity in nutrition, in pharmaceuticals, in material science. It's basically a new raw ingredient, a new building block for the food system that's what we're working on. And I think that, the protein conversation is fantastic, but that's not the only piece of the puzzle here. There's, in our case, even plant nutrition becomes really important because we produce a fertilizer product as a byproduct of our mealworm production. They make frass. Frass is bug poop. So, frass happens at Beta Hatch and it's actually very valuable. So that is, again, I think these conversations can get sometimes a little oversimplified on the protein side.
Yeah. And I think it's also important in agriculture to recognize that, circular economy isn't really anything new when it comes to farming. And, Alex, you're on a farm. I come from a farming background myself. I think, having grown up around farmers, you're using everything that you have available, right? And yes, new technologies come along and adopting those is a great thing. But it's easy to look at an agricultural system and say that it's broken. But at the same time, you need to look at where we've come from. So over the last 50 years, the agricultural evolution that we've seen has been massive. And, if you take that over a 200-year time frame or a 10,000-year time frame, it's come on leaps and bounds. So it's a natural evolution. And it's great that we're making all these great leaps forward. But I think another part of that, and when we talk about messaging, it shouldn't be criticizing the people that are making the food that we eat and saying that they are bad people, vilifying them. Because I think, farmers have always had a really important role in our food system. And maybe over the last few decades, we've forgotten about that.
Love it.
Yeah.
Great first part of our chat. And I would like to now kick off our second part of our questions here in our Virtual Coffee episode 14. Before doing so, we would like to again encourage our audience. I'm always looking here at what's already been filtered in terms of the questions that are coming in. Please feel free to submit. We have roughly another 15 minutes-ish to filter 3 questions, and we will reply and respond here live. We will pick one per industry fellow. And you guys have been mentioning something very important. That before we switch into the second phase, I would like to emphasize, based on our audience of executives that represent global corporations, which you were mentioning, the business platform and a business platform, or only functions. If corporations and the rest of the ecosystem, the entire ecosystem, collaborates, right? On the other hand, the corporations nowadays have the big challenge of innovating, right? Because they are the big players, the so-called dinosaurs that need the brilliant minds, the faster-paced startups and the startup landscape to collaborate and create new things, right? But the question is how to approach it, right? And either you have acceleration plans in place on whatnot, or you are having a plan and initiative to invest in startups such as Virginia startups and Pete startups, right? And many corporations say, well, Tommaso, this is not our core business. How can we do that? How can we find the startups? How can we vet the startups? How can we create a deal flow? How can we understand what is IP? What is an opportunity? Well, that's exactly where a CVC, a corporate VC, comes in place, or a CVC as a service. It's basically an entity and an outside organ that helps and partners with those global corporations to make investments a significant and important part of their innovation initiatives in order to accelerate in innovation impact rather than just driving innovation without maybe a real transformative result. Why am I saying that? Well, I represent one, Awesome Ventures. If you want to know more, send an email to cvc@awesome.io. Awesome, you write it AWESM.io. More than happy to have a virtual coffee with you on that topic. But enough about investing in startups and in startups opportunity. I see here some more questions flowing in. I would like now to start with Pete and his mission on CO2 protein. What is coming down the pipeline as it pertains to the CO2 protein, animal feed and foods? Curious to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, so I guess echoing what you've just said there in the sense that the partnership is the only way forward, especially when we're talking about, developing a novel technology that we're integrating quite high up the value chain. So what we've gone to great efforts to do at Deep Branch over the last 2 years is really work on our partnerships with all the key stakeholders that we interact with. So a couple of months ago, we announced a big partnership that we've been working on with 10 different institutes and organizations. Amongst them are Drax, who are the UK's biggest renewable energy producer. They generate bioenergy, and we use the CO2 from their bioenergy power plant to make our protein. The protein that we generate, we then provide to BioMar, who are one of the world's biggest aquafeed producers, and AB Agri, who are one of Europe's biggest producers of chicken feed. So we're co-developing feeds for salmon and feeds for poultry with these 2 feed producers respectively. And over the next 2 years, we'll be getting those market-ready feed recipes done. That will lead to a point in 2 years' time where we have our market launch facility up and running. In the meantime, we've recently announced our pilot facility, which we're currently building here in the Netherlands, and we're super excited about that. It's a new geography for us, and I've been practicing my Dutch to ensure that goes swimmingly. But thankfully, a lot of people here speak English, which is good. And yeah, that's basically what's coming up next on the radar for Deep Branch over the next couple of years.
I love it. Congratulations on your partnerships and on your pipeline. I'm really curious to follow what you guys are doing. Virginia, let's talk about the Beta Hatch IP. You guys enable, how can you enable actually? What are your experiences? Insects to cost effectively meet the global scale of demand for animal feed and crop fertilizer?
Yeah, I mean, I think scale is always one of the biggest questions for the sector because yeah, the food markets are so huge, and feed in particular, aquafeed alone is $64 billion. These are huge markets, and so there's a lot of need for volume. And so this is something that we've really been thinking strategically about. How do we unlock that rapid scaling, and how do we unlock volume? And looking at successful models that have done that. We've taken a more distributed approach to our production. So companies like Protix there in the Netherlands have built a very large, very expensive factory. But I think that those solutions are not always going to be workable in all geographies. And here in the US, there's certainly a need for more rural economic development. It's a very large country, so there's a need for shortening of transportation distances. That's a huge part of the carbon footprint of our food. And so our approach is much more distributed with this focus on sort of smaller scale of operations. And it's modeled after successful production of livestock in this country. So I think that there's a lot of need, not just for technology innovation, but also business model innovation. I think on the technology side, there's also just multiple sort of pillars of that technology. And you could specialize just in, say, breeding and the genetic piece of that equation. You could specialize, as a feed producer for insects and diet formulations. But one of the challenges when you have a new industry like the insect sector is you kind of need to do a little bit of it all to make your business succeed. And that's always the challenge of being an early mover, is that the whole, it's sort of like, Tesla, this idea of making motorized electric vehicles. They needed to also be a battery company before they could really be the car company. So I think that we have in the food sector some similar challenges with new innovations, is that you need to be addressing multiple parts of that environment that supports your production. And so that's where the involvement of, as Pete's mentioned, partners is very valuable. Because it's very difficult as a small company to do all of that. So trying to find the right partners to help you in each parts of that supply chain.
I love your storytelling approach. It's always easy to understand and break down the single elements and the challenges that one faces when living the dream as a startup entrepreneur. So thanks for doing this. Speaking of startups and the challenges of startup, Alex, I want to pick your brain on this. And there are many entrepreneurs or projects at universities or non-universities that are maybe thinking of launching something in sustainable protein, right, Virginia?
Yes.
So by the way, I had already this conversation with one of participants a couple of months ago, and we went in the direction meat analog. I like that one too.
Yeah, it sounds a little mechanical. I'd be curious what Alex's thoughts are.
This is a conversation for other hours while you have a beer and you cheers on that and you brainstorm. So back to the startups. So one has in mind to launch a startup, right? It's okay. This is what I want to launch, what I want to release. So this is the new product. So what it needs to be considered? What are pitfalls based on your experiences? What can you share here with the audience that is watching?
Well, I think that you need to go through a process, and that process really is about having, such as what we do at Brand First, right? What we do is we will look at the competitive landscape, we'll look at it and, we'll immerse ourselves in that to understand it, right? So what is it derivative of, and how can understanding the competition bring about more understanding about this new company's innovation and how they want to communicate it? So we position, their brand through naming, tagline, identity, messaging, all of those things. They're all steps that we take to try to get a hold on what the front-facing language is going to be, as well as logos and lovely things like that. So at the end of the day, when someone picks up a package and they're looking at it, the right things are communicated. But it's not just the package, it's also information on a website, it's information on social media, it's all of those things playing together to cohesively to dispel misinformation and notions that, for example, like Virginia was talking about bugs, chickens eating bugs, right? So yes, chickens do eat bugs, but you don't really want to necessarily bring that forward, right? Because people start thinking, ew, bugs, chickens. Well, it's part of reality, but sometimes you have to really kind of skim some of those things out to make sure that you're not putting somebody off, right? So, an example is chirps. That is a chip that was made with insects. I believe it was cricket powder that was integrated into the chirps. It was very interesting how they marketed it. And they've changed a couple times their iterations of packaging. The second you hear insects, though, and if somebody's put off by eating insects, they're going to be put off. So the question is how do you find the language and the explanation of why eating insects is good, why it might not, why it could taste good, and lead with that and not the opposite things. I mean, that's really very obvious stuff, but it's amazing how complex, perception is when it comes to people assuming things and jumping to conclusions.
Yeah, it sounds obvious once you hear it, right, Alex? But the capability of you having a framework or a Canva that guides you and gets you there is tremendously challenging, because, and then we go back what we were discussing, Peter, Virginia, right? From a startup perspective, you have so much on the table. And most probably, most of the scientists are more technically oriented and have the capability of expressing more technically what they're doing, right? So, and then it comes to the launch, right? And you have a great product, but the value and the value proposition, the differentiator, right? So many times I've had exactly the same, in all the acceleration programs that we've been doing here in Silicon Valley. The challenge there, okay, how are you different? I mean, so what? What's your unique selling point? How are you different? Right? What's your value proposition there? So this is actually, and then you see brands, right, who simply out of complexity they create simplicity, which is and say, wow, this brand resonates to me, right? Boom, this is, oh yeah, I like the slogan, I like the value proposition, and this is a huge journey, and that's when consumer connect with a brand, right? So what sounds obvious is actually a really challenging pathway and a challenging learning, right? Virginia, Pete, what do you?
I'm going to jump in and just put the final nail in the coffin of alternative protein. I think one of the challenges with that kind of language is alternative suggests equality. It's like, different, but it's, the same. And I think that what we're building and speaking to value is actually something that's a better product. And that is on both sort of all these sustainability claims, which some of them still need to be sort of, it will take time to weigh those out and to really validate that at scale. But at least on a performance basis, like mealworms, you get 30% improvements in feed conversion, 35% improvements in growth, 50% improvements in survival. We're seeing it, this is not just a substitute. Yeah. And so I think that's something as well, just trying to find new language that's not just substitute language, and trying to really elevate the product, because the value is clear. And, most of our customers, I should say, on the decision-making side are scientists driven by the performance metrics and sort of the cost considerations, but it needs to be married with a sort of pull on the consumer side, right? They need to see the appeal for how it's going to help them sell their products better. And so certainly that's where, Alex, who's got this sort of focus on messaging, that kind of work is important to do in the sector for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then always it depends on what generation are we serving, right? Generation Y, Generation Z, or even, the Generation AA, the battery generation, which comes after the Generation Z, right? They're very self-aware, right? That we need a sustainable way of being fed, of eating, right? So they're already grown, they have it in their genes. Well, guys, ladies and gentlemen, really amazing conversation. It could go for hours, but we are almost wrapping up, and usually we always have in our virtual coffees questions that I'm looking here. Yep, we have 3 questions right now. Awesome. And I see you already that very active California today. I would like to start with Virginia. Questions coming from the audience, and this one is coming from Davis, California. Elizabeth, thanks for the question. As the world's population grows, the production of animal feed is an increasing strain on land and water. Insects could provide much of the protein animals need at a much lower environmental cost. Question: are insects the ideal animal feed of the future? Thanks, Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I won't disagree with that. Certainly, my job as the founder of this company, I truly believe insects have an incredible potential to fill huge niches in the food system. What I like to just remind everyone of is that the food system tends to do best when it emulates nature. So we see polyculture outperforming monoculture, and we see, crop diversity improving, the immune function of different crops. And bugs are part of the natural process of nature. They're the recyclers of nutrients, and they're the base of most food chains in the wild. So it makes sense that they would be part of the food system. We just haven't had the technology yet to do that at large scale. And so that's what we've been building, is the ability to basically elevate insects back into their role in the food system. And, when you look at, I think that we're seeing a lot of this sort of renewal of old farming concepts coming in and now being industrialized to match the scale of our food systems.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Virginia. And Elizabeth, again, thanks for the question. Question for Alex. Carl from Berkeley, very close here. What are some of the biggest challenges that will either significantly slow down or prevent environmentally friendly foods from reaching consumer accessibility? Alex.
Environmental considerations. I would say that the biggest hurdles that I can see really is scaling things up for companies. That's the biggest issue at hand, especially with alternative proteins. Being able to catalyze them, grow them in the tanks that they're growing them, and figuring out how to do that is a huge task. But I would say from a more traditional aspect, just within packaging, if I could take it there, it really is making sure that when something is launched and it's new and it's innovative, that the prescient points of why it's good, and keeping in mind that there's competition, you're competing with all of the proteins. So you really need to have the right platform mechanism to communicate that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alex. And thanks, Carl, for your question. And last but not least, for Pete here, we have Ruby from LA, Los Angeles. Thanks, Ruby. Why should we consider eating a burger made out of CO2 captured from the air? And how soon could we expect to see it available in supermarket and in restaurants? I love that. Pete, what is it you are responding to that one?
Well, so our primary focus is actually on developing CO2-based animal feeds. So if you're talking about a burger, it's more likely that it will be made of an animal that's eaten our product, right? But that isn't discounting that in the future, we do think that it's a viable opportunity to move into the human food market. And to Alex's point, this is where getting that messaging exactly right is really important. In terms of putting a timeline on that, I'd anticipate some point in the next 5 years, you could see a CO2-based burger. And I'm certainly looking forward to that.
Well, that's awesome. So within the next 5 years, again, thank you so much, Ruby here from LA. And with that, we'd like to wrap up our episode 14 on November 5th, 2020. I always love to humbly learn every single day and every single episode at a time. So thank you so much to allowing us, Virginia, Pete, and Alex, to pick your brain, to share your knowledge, your experience, your insights with the world. Only together we are stronger. That's exactly the purpose here. And before I let you go, actually one question from my side. Now, from a future back perspective, imagine yourself in 30 years time, 2050, writing November 2050. How are we going to eat? How is the food system by then? And hold on, I give you a second or two to think about that. Meanwhile, you think on your answer, and I'm really curious, and I'm confident the audience wants to see your future back perspective too. For our audience, next week, same time, same place, should be November the 12th. We'll have our top floor, our 14th episode of our top floor, which should be the second last or third last. Now we are almost wrapping up the season 2, where we are handpicking two startups, and 2 industry fellows. So we are going to experience and dive into some innovation from a startup perspective. So don't miss it. Same time, same place, 8:30 a.m. PST. If you want to see who is lined up, or if you want to join, or if you want to nominate some industry fellows or some startups, feel free to take a look at corporate.Silicon Valley, corporate.siliconvalley.ly. Some of you might follow us already. And back to the final question. Future back, it's November 2050, Virginia. How is the food system? How are we going to eat by then? Curious to hear.
Well, I would really hope at that point we have figured out how to feed everyone. I think that's one of, we've been talking a lot about sort of first world problems of fancy, novelty products. But I think that the reason I started my business is that I think we have a lot of challenges in sort of the supply chain to feed everyone. And so I would certainly hope, but by that time, we've solved a lot of those challenges. And that comes back to having more technologies that are decoupled from climate and the uncertainties of climate, more technologies that can be locally produced and can shorten supply chains to, remove this reliance on international transportation, which is where a lot of spoilage happens. And I think that we're going to see that the word waste is not going to have any meaning anymore, because we'll have found value in all of the byproducts and co-products that are being produced. So that's sort of how I view it. I'm not thinking so much about what's on my plate, but I think sort of more about what the planet's food system looks like. And I would really hope that by then we've got some more sustainable solutions that are feeding everyone healthful nutrition that they need, and that no one is going hungry.
What a valuable vision. Thanks for sharing that. Alex, what are your thoughts? 2050, how are we going to eat? What's the food system like?
Wow. I mean, maybe printed food will have more of a place where we can actually tailor the nutrients and the calories and all of the things that, obviously we need. Maybe digestibility will be less of an issue when it comes to different proteins. I think that that's one of the larger issues, is people's digestion of new proteins and making sure that it's easy to do. And then, of course, the air burgers will be available at every corner.
Speaking of which, thanks, Alex. Pete, 2050, your thoughts, how are we going to eat? Obviously, air burgers there, and what else?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I hope for in 2050 is that, as consumers, we can walk into a supermarket or a grocery store and really just make these decisions without thinking about a trade-off when it comes to taste and environmental impact, right? Because we fixed the system behind it. So really, I guess the only thing informing your decision as a consumer would be Alex's great branding on a packet versus someone else who's got some terrible branding there, right? But what that really means is fixing the food system from the bottom up. And the way we see it is, if we can fix animal feed, then we can at least speak to a huge portion of the market that maybe don't see moving away from an animal-based diet as something that they want to do. But we can at least, really significantly impact the environmental damage associated with producing animal products in some form. So, what I want to see is a more nuanced food system, whereby we can implement change at each level, consumer level, feed level, and even before that, ingredients level, to make sure that everyone is moving in the right direction and everyone's happy and not hungry.
Happy and not hungry. What a great sentence to finish here. our episode 14. Thank you so much, Virginia, Pete, Alex. Really humbled here to have you on our episode. And we like to close our broadcast always with something that I learned to craft over the last 20 years. I say I learned to craft in terms of as an entrepreneur, became an investor. And it's a quote. The quote goes like this: never forget where you come from. It keeps you humble. But where you come from cannot limit you where you want to go. And with that, thank you so much. Okay, all the best. Stay in touch, and let's make the world a better place and more healthier. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.